3 properties, a joint bank account, and 11 years of a marriage were gone in one signed folder. $23 sat in Maria Delgado's coat pocket, the only cash she had left in the world. In her bag was a leather-bound recipe book with 214 pages, the handwriting of a grandmother who had died before any of this began. 2 years later, Maria Delgado stood under television lights in Memphis, Tennessee, answering questions about a deal with a company most people only shop at on weekends. At the same moment, on the other side of the city, David Whitfield was signing a lease on an office he could no longer afford. He did not expect what he saw on the news that night. Maria grew up in a small house on Valentine Avenue, the kind of house where the kitchen was the only room that mattered. Her grandmother, Rosa, ran that kitchen for 40 years, feeding neighbors who could not always pay and writing down every recipe in a single leather book, because she said a recipe not written down was a memory waiting to be lost. Rosa gave Maria that book the week she turned 19. Inside the front cover, in blue ink that had faded to almost gray, Rosa had written one line for her granddaughter to keep. Do not rush the roux. It was advice about cooking. It was also, Maria would learn much later, advice about life. Maria married David Whitfield when she was 26. He was a lone officer then, ambitious, charming in the way men are charming when they know exactly what they want from a room. By the time their son Eli was 7 and their daughter Nora was 4, David had become a real estate developer with a growing portfolio and a growing habit of explaining calmly why every account should be in his name only, for tax reasons, for liability reasons, for reasons that always sounded reasonable and were never explained twice. 14 months before Maria noticed anything wrong, David began meeting privately with an estate attorney named Gregory Paulson, a man in his 50s with an office on Poplar Avenue, 3 framed diplomas, and a reputation for making difficult marriages disappear cleanly on paper. Paulson did not think of Maria as a person losing her family. He thought of her as a structural liability to be isolated, one document at a time. Her name came off the mortgage first, quietly, during what David called a refinance. Then her name came off the joint account, during what David called a bank error he would fix later. He never fixed it. The recipe book sat untouched on a shelf for 6 years, because Maria had stopped believing, somewhere in that marriage, that anyone wanted the things she made with her hands anymore. 3 weeks before David filed for divorce, Maria still did not know the house had already been refinanced into his name alone. She learned it in a lawyer's office with fluorescent lights, a stack of paper across the table, and a folder David's attorney called simple. Her name was not on the house. Her name was not on the accounts. Her name, in the eyes of the paperwork, had already been erased from 11 years of a life she had helped build. On the morning of the hearing, David sat across the courtroom in a gray suit, calm, composed, a man who managed properties for a living now managing his own marriage like a foreclosure. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The documents did the work for him. When the judge granted him the house, the accounts, and primary time with the children pending a custody evaluation, David thanked the court in a level voice and did not look at Maria on his way out. She stood outside the courthouse with $23 in her coat pocket and the recipe book in a canvas bag, because it was the only object from the house she had thought to grab before the locks were changed. For the first 3 days, she slept on her sister's couch. On the 4th day, she opened the recipe book for the first time in 6 years. The pages were soft at the edges from Rosa's hands turning them for decades. On the inside cover, the ink had faded, but the words were still there. Do not rush the roux. Maria read it out loud in an empty kitchen that was not hers, and for the first time since the hearing, she cried without trying to stop herself. 12 days later, a woman named Delphine Cross, 71 years old, a retired nurse who lived 2 doors down from Maria's sister, knocked on the door with a folding table she said she was not using anymore. She said she had watched Maria carry that recipe book in and out of the house every day like it mattered, and she figured whatever was in it was worth setting a table for. Maria baked her first batch of cookies that week using Rosa's recipe for brown butter pecan shortbread, the one with a note in the margin that said, in Rosa's handwriting, "This one is for when someone comes home." She sold $11 worth of cookies at a folding table outside a laundromat on Jackson Avenue. It was not much. It was the first money she had earned with her own hands in 11 years, and it felt like more than it was. 3 weeks after the folding table, a man named Otis Green, 58 years old, who ran a barbershop 2 blocks away, offered her the empty corner of his shop window on weekends, because he said he had grown up on food like that and it was a shame to let it go to waste on a sidewalk. A librarian named Renata Kim, 34, printed Maria a set of simple flyers for free after closing hours because she said her own grandmother had a recipe box just like it, and some things deserve a chance to be read by more than one family. The custody evaluation dragged through the following months, David's name appearing on it repeatedly as the stable, employed, home-yowning parent, Maria's name appearing as unemployed, resource-limited, and unstable in a section that did not mention she was building a business by hand because no one had asked. At 2 in the morning, 6 weeks before the appeal hearing, Maria sat at her sister's kitchen table with the recipe book open, doing the only thing she knew how to do when the fear got too loud. She baked. She whispered Rose's line to herself while she worked the dough, not rushing it, not forcing it, the way her grandmother had taught her before she could read. A pastor named Marcus Ibe, 46 years old, who ran a small church with a food pantry attached, began buying cookies in bulk for Sunday gatherings, not out of charity, but because he said the shortbread reminded 3 different grandmothers in his congregation of their own kitchens, and word like that moves fast in a small community. By the 5th month, Maria had saved enough from the folding table and the barbershop window to buy a used step van for $1,800 from a mechanic named Ray Alvarez, 39, who fixed the transmission for the cost of parts because he said he liked watching someone build something instead of watching someone tear something down for once. Maria painted the side of the van herself, in white letters on faded blue, Rose's Rue, and underneath it, smaller, Do Not Rush the Rue. Meanwhile, David's development deals began slowing. 2 contracts he had been counting on for the year fell through in the same month, not because of Maria, but because of decisions he had made long before the divorce, decisions his attorney Gregory Paulson had quietly warned him about and he had ignored. 6 months after the folding table, a woman named Carol Whitfield, David's own sister, began calling Maria in secret. Carol had been sending updates about Maria's finances and business to David for months, not out of loyalty to him, but because David had co-signed the mortgage on Carol's house 2 years earlier, and Carol was terrified of what would happen to her own family if she refused him anything. Every phone call she made to David felt like paying rent on a house she was slowly losing anyway. She never told Maria this. She carried it alone, and it was eating her from the inside in a way she did not know how to stop. At the custody hearing, 7 months after the divorce, the courtroom was fuller than usual because a local reporter named Dana Chu had heard about the food truck through a neighborhood post and wanted to run a small human interest piece. She sat in the back with a notepad, not expecting the hearing itself to become the story. David's attorney, in an attempt to paint Maria as financially unstable, introduced a document showing a pattern of communication between Maria and Carol Whitfield, the very evidence Carol had fed to David for months, without realizing the log also proved exactly who had been feeding it and when. Under a judge's direct question, Carol Whitfield admitted, in open court, that she had been reporting Maria's private information to David for nearly a year, out of fear over her own mortgage, not out of concern for the children. The room went quiet. Maria did not look angry. She looked like she finally understood why some conversations with Carol had felt so careful. Carol, for her part, looked relieved for the first time in a year, because the secret had stopped costing her sleep the moment it was finally out of her hands. The judge did not rule that day, but Dana Chu had her story, and it was not the story David expected. 2 weeks later, the local news ran a 4-minute segment called The Recipe Book and the Truck, about a mother rebuilding a life with a grandmother's handwritten cookbook and a step van painted by hand. The clip was shared close to 200,000 times in 9 days. Orders came in from 3 states. A woman in Nashville asked if Rose's Rue shipped nationally. It did not yet. David responded the way David always responded, with paper. His attorney sent a cease and desist letter to Maria, claiming the name Rose's Rue infringed on a family trademark he claimed through a defunct catering business from a decade earlier, a Busin SS that had never been active in Maria's lifetime of using the recipes. The letter was mailed to the food truck's business address, and a copy was mailed, deliberately, to 2 of the grocery chains that had begun making inquiries about carrying the shortbread on shelves. It was meant to scare off partners before they signed anything. It backfired. One of those grocery buyers forwarded the letter to a regional manager who happened to be reviewing Dana Chu's segment that same week and asked a simple question. If this business is thriving enough to threaten, why aren't we already working with them? 11 months after the folding table outside the laundromat, a regional buyer for Walmart called Maria Delgado directly and asked to set up a meeting about carrying Rose's Rouge shortbread in stores across 3 states, an order large enough to require her first real production kitchen. David's overreach became the center of the custody appeal. The judge, reviewing the cease and desist letter alongside Carol's courtroom admission and the growing, verifiable evidence of Maria's stable and expanding business, reversed the earlier custody arrangement, granting Maria primary time with Eli and Nora, with David receiving standard visitation pending further review. In the following months, David's losses arrived the way losses tend to arrive once the paper stops holding a person up. 2 of his development partners quietly withdrew from a joint project once the cease and desist story became public in local business circles, costing him roughly $400,000 in projected revenue. His name was mentioned unfavorably in 2 industry newsletters that covered the courtroom admission of witness tampering through a family member. His fiancée at the time, a woman named Priya Anand, ended the engagement after reading the news coverage herself, saying she had not signed up to be the next name stripped off a document. Gregory Paulson, his attorney, dropped him as a client after David missed 2 retainer payments, the same kind of quiet financial slippage David had once engineered against Maria. Within a year, David sold the family home to cover mortgage payments on properties that were no longer generating income, moving into a rented apartment above a dry cleaner on Summer Avenue. None of it was framed as punishment. It simply arrived, one loss after another, the way a house settles once the foundation underneath it stops being maintained. Maria signed the agreement with Walmart in a downtown office building, flanked by Delphine Cross, Otis Green, Renata Kim, Ray Alvarez, and Pastor Ibe, 5 people who had each given her one small thing when she had almost nothing. The production kitchen opened 4 months later on a quiet street in Binghamton, employing 11 people from the neighborhood, including Carol Whitfield, who asked for a job herself once the divorce settled and admitted, quietly, that she wanted to work for something honest for once. On the night Rose's Rouge shipped its first pallet to a distribution center, Maria sat in her new kitchen with the recipe book open on the counter, the same page it had always opened to, the brown butter shortbread recipe with the note in the margin. Eli, now 9, walked in from the other room holding a plate she had left for him, and without knowing she was watching, he said the same thing his great-great-grandmother's recipe had always been waiting to hear. "This is the best in the world." Maria did not say anything back. She only watched him eat, the recipe book open beside her, the faded blue ink still legible after all these years. "Do not rush the roux." Would you have forgiven Carol Whitfield for what she did? Leave your answer below. I will see you in the next one. This story is a work of fiction. No real persons, companies, or events are depicted. The patterns shown here: financial isolation in a marriage, quiet asset restructuring during divorce, custodial disadvantage for a parent without independent income, and pressure placed on family members to report on a spouse, are common and real. If you or someone you know is experiencing coercive control or domestic abuse, the National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233, and resources are also available at womenslaw.org.